around. So if you've been to these before, we like to share the take-home messages up front. And the first thing to note is that when we look at the demographics that are shaping Victoria, we're seeing a return to more normal patterns post-pandemic. So we'll spend a bit of time today looking at the patterns in overseas and internal migration in particular, and how they influence each region and how it's growing and changing. Secondly, what we're seeing in our latest forecast is that over 3/4 of the growth that's forecast over the next 25 years will occur within 80 kilometres of the Melbourne CBD. So this is quite a different story to what we saw when we looked at New South Wales 6 weeks ago, for those of you that joined that webinar, where regional centres like Newcastle and the Hunter, Illawarra, and even the far north, they accounted for a greater share of that state's growth. But that's not the case in Victoria. We're going to take a look at the role of students as a cohort that is contributing to the historically high rates of population growth that we're seeing currently. But this group are also somewhat unique in their housing needs, and in some cases, that rebound in the overseas student population is actually slotting back into accommodation and housing that was vacant throughout the pandemic. So we'll take a look at a case study around that. And looking further into the forecast period, we see a really interesting shift in the location of growth. So what we're seeing is as greenfield capacity in Melbourne's west starts to fill up, and the southeast slows down around Casey and Cardinia, what we see as a result is that the northern growth areas start to pick up the slack, as well as the CBD and inner Melbourne. And so that the final point here might be familiar to anybody that has done any work regarding demographics or population forecasting, and that's that just because an area isn't growing significantly, it doesn't mean that it isn't changing. So this is the case across Victoria, and you'll see it in every part of the state. But the northeastern region, covering places like Shepparton and Wangaratta, Echuca and Wodonga, gives us a really great case study that we'll be exploring today. So just a brief introduction for those of you that might not have joined these webinars before and aren't familiar with ID and the work that we do. So ID stands for Informed Decisions. We're a company of demographers and housing analysts, economists, census data experts, social researchers. We're quite a broad spectrum of views that we bring to looking at places. We're only a small organisation. There's just under 50 of us, but we've got a really proud 25-year history of working particularly with local government, state government and the private sector to help people make evidence-based decisions when they're investing and planning for place. If you don't know us as a brand, you might have come across us if you've done any desktop research about a place in Australia. And that's because we maintain this suite of local area information tools that covers over 80% of the Australian population. So these tools are sponsored by the councils, and in most cases they're made available as a public information resource that gives really rich, detailed local area information about demographics, population forecasting component that we maintain, local area economics, housing, and the views and the lived experiences of residents. So we'll be focusing mostly on the population forecasting component of that evidence base today. But of course, we draw on the expertise of people from across the ID business in developing our forecasts. And we'll also look at these different lenses when we look at students in a few slides' time. So the forecasts that we're sharing, they come from an independent research program that's run by ID called the National Forecasting Program. That was previously called SAFI, if you've been with us for a little while. I'll take a moment just to explain how that program works, because it provides a bit of a framework for the presentation we're giving today. So our forecasters, we follow a cycle. We begin with a really top-down view of Australia, and we work our way down to an increasingly detailed view of places. So what's the forecast for Australia? What's the forecast and how much of that will go to Victoria? How much goes to each region within Victoria? And then finally, how much goes down to each suburb and each local area? So in these webinars and our other published analysis, we share all of our information down to a regional level, and then we fund the National Forecasting Program by selling our forecasts through a range of products and different consulting services. And what we're selling is actually our local area forecasts. So just wanted to mention that forecasting population, it may seem to the uninitiated as something that you might be able to do on the back of an envelope. An area was growing by 1,000 people last year. Let's assume that the same thing is going to happen next year. But as you'll see, hopefully today in our presentation, there are many different factors that impact what makes populations grow and change in different places. And we've put a few of them on the screen here. But I hope what you take from today's presentation is that these different factors, they influence different places to different extents. So to do this work properly, you really need to do it on scale. That's the only way that you can get a detailed forecast for every one of the 15,000 odd suburbs that cover Australia, using a consistent methodology that lets you compare forecasts for different places across different time periods. So the other take-home message today is we've done this work so that you don't have to, and I will talk through some of the different ways that you can access that local area forecast information a bit later in the pres. But for now, let's just get into the forecast results, starting at the very top of that cycle. What's driving Australia's overall growth? And some of you who joined us for our New South Wales webinar, some of this might look a bit familiar, but we do have some new data from the ABS and some new information to share today as well. So our population's doubled since the early 70s. In average annual growth terms, that's 1.4% per annum. Over the past 10 years, we've had a relatively high growth rate of between 1.5 and 2%, which puts us among the 5 fastest growing OECD countries. The last census in 2021, our population was just over 25.5 million people, and our forecasts are for the 25 years to 2046, in which time we'll average 1.1% growth annually, resulting in 9.2 million people being added to our population, which gets us to just under 35 million by 2046. So what's driving this growth? At the national level, there's only really 3 things that can impact the population, and that's people being born, people dying, and people coming to Australia from overseas. So at the population level, these patterns are highly predictable. The fertility rate, for example, is the average number of children that a woman will have in her life, and that's been declining steadily since the 60s, when the pill was introduced. While the fertility rate is falling, though, the number of women in Australia is growing. So on balance, the forecast is for more births, for births to increase from 300,000 to just under 400,000 per year by 2046. However, we also do have an aging population, and though we're living longer, we're not living forever. And so when you look at the forecast number of deaths, which are calculated based on age-adjusted life expectancies, you can see that number of deaths is also growing from 165,000 in 2021 to 280,000 across the country by the end of the forecast period in 2046. So as a result, the net of births and deaths, what we call natural increase, continues to add over 100,000 people to the population each year. But the really big story at the national level is obviously overseas migration. And that's the one we're going to spend some time on today, because since the mid-2000s, as you can see here, it's been the main driver of Australia's population growth and a key assumption in our forecasts. And in recent years, it's obviously also been highly volatile. So you're probably aware of what happened with overseas migration during COVID, and if you're not, you can see it quite clearly in the graph there. When we closed borders in March 2020, it triggered the first decline in Australia's population since World War I. In 2022, as we came out of the pandemic and the border closures period, there were incentive schemes in place to try and boost migration in the wake of the pandemic. So things like visa refunds for international students and backpackers, and it's safe to say that those schemes, they worked. The latest figures we have are for migration to the September quarter of 2023, and in that year, Australia had a net gain of 528,000 people from overseas, with arrivals up 73% to 737,000. And as you can see, that far exceeds previous highs in overseas migration. So in December, the Department of Home Affairs responded to this spike with a new migration strategy. And the goal of this strategy was to cut the net migration intake to 250,000 in the year to June 2025. though the government have stopped short of calling that a policy or even a target. And it's worth saying that the government can't influence every part of this overseas migration cohort. They can't, for example, restrict the return of Australian citizens, which are in the dark blue here. But as you can see, the temporary visa holders, that's the light blue bars there, they make up the lion's share of arrivals. And in this chart, we are just looking at arrivals, not the net figure. Many of these people in the blue are international students or people on holiday visas. So the migration strategy has introduced stronger English language and what they call genuine student tests, with other options such as higher visa application fees, or even caps on student numbers if that doesn't have the desired effect. We're going to look at students a bit more in a moment, but just in terms of what this means for our forecasts, our long-term assumption is that Australia will continue to have a net gain of 235,000 people from overseas each year. So that's in line with the very best information that we have from the government, including the latest intergenerational report, the latest federal budget papers, and the intended effects of that migration strategy that we just spoke about. Just before we move on from overseas migration, I just want to take a moment to really focus in on students, as they're really core to the story of Victoria, and particularly inner Melbourne in the post-COVID era. And I actually sat down and discussed this with some of the experts from across ID, and they gave me a range of perspectives on the students as a cohort. So we've already looked at the demographics. We know that international students are predominantly in younger age groups. They're on temporary visas. As of January this year, there were 166,000 international students studying in Victoria, and 13 of the top 15 countries of origin for those students were in Asia. I spoke to our economists about it, and they had a different view again, which was they're preparing to release new economic data in May, and what they're expecting is that it'll show a slowdown in economic growth, growth per capita in our capital cities. So that's a measure of standard of living. That's interesting just in and of itself, given where these students are particularly coming back into our cities. But the economists have also worked with the City of Melbourne recently to look at housing for key workers. And though this work wasn't focused just on students, what it did highlight was the importance of workers in jobs like hospitality, commercial cleaning, caring roles, drivers, retail workers, basically jobs that are connected to a physical workplace that can't be done remotely. And one of the study's main findings or recommendations was that affordable housing has to be treated as essential infrastructure that supports the proper functioning of our local economies and our local communities by giving these workers somewhere to live that's close to their place of work. And much of the conversation around our currently high migration is about housing, and rightly so. We're well behind where we need to be to accommodate the population growth that we've seen in the last decade or two. But this is a nuanced story, and we need to look at housing always in a local context. So the Melbourne inner region, it is the epicenter of overseas migration rebound that we've seen back into Australia. In 2022, the suburb of Carlton, which is a student district home to the University of Melbourne, Carlton alone gained 3,700 people from overseas, and that's more than double the previous year's intake. But we haven't seen that many new dwellings built in Carlton, so where are all these people living? I was amazed to hear from Johnny when we sat down and looked at this, that in 2016, there were 19,500 vacant dwellings across inner Melbourne. In 2021, during the pandemic, that was up to 55,000. So in this local area, there was the capacity to reabsorb some of that returning student population. So when we look at that overall net overseas migration figure being driven by the students who are coming back into Australia, when you look at how that impacts housing at a local area level, it's really important that we look at that local area nuance. And there's data from our social research team that made that point really clearly. So they told me that they conduct a survey called Living in Australia that surveys a representative sample of people from across Australia. And they told me that 18 to 34-year-olds across Australia, for them, affordable, decent housing is the second most important attribute of livability, but the most poorly experienced of the 16 that they survey. So they asked people about 16 different attributes of livability, affordable, decent housing, the second most important for 18 to 34-year-olds, but the most poorly experienced attribute of livability in that age group. And the other thing that was interesting is that those experiences of affordable, decent housing are also worse in inner city areas across Australia. So housing is actually the only attribute of all those that we measure where the experience in the outer suburbs report better experiences related to housing than people in the inner city. So one final thing before we move on from the tops down story, and that's that 2 weeks ago we did get new data from the ABS which showed us that this rebound in overseas migration, as we said, has predominantly affected our cities, with the combined capital cities of Australia growing by 517,000 people, or 3% in the year to September last year. So our colleague Glenn, the census expert, has written a really terrific blog about this. It's got an interactive map in it. We'll include a link to that in our notes that we send around this afternoon, but that's all present day stuff. As forecasters, what we're really interested in is what this data tells us about the future, and there's two things that it gives us. The first is that it gives us some context on this overseas migration rebound. So in the 5 years to March 2020, which is when we close those international borders, Australia added 1.17 million people from overseas. That's an average of just under 235,000 people per annum. So we now have 3.5 years of migration data since those closures, which includes the depths of people leaving and also not coming when the borders were closed. And then from the December quarter 2021, when we've seen the COVID correction, we've seen Australia hit historical highs as people have come back in, and we haven't had the corresponding outflows and departures to make up that net migration figure. So in that time, in that last 3.5 years, we've added 784,000 people. That's an average of 224,000 per year coming back in. So in that sense, we still haven't actually caught up to where we would have been if COVID never happened, and we maintain the level of NOM intake from the pre-pandemic period. With that said, we've still got 2 quarters of data to come where there's no question we're still behind where we need to be in terms of housing stock to match the population growth that we've seen in recent years. But we'll get more to that shortly. But the second thing that new data shows us is about internal migration, or how people are moving around within Australia. Only a limited time series for this data, 21, 22, and 22, 23. But these charts, they're quite small, but what they show us is that this is looking at migration flows to and from inner Melbourne. And you can see there that although the volumes, there was a drop in volumes, the patterns that we're seeing are very consistent. So this is a really good example of how this, what we're calling a return to normal demographic programming, gives us a great deal of confidence in the population movements and migration assumptions that are baked into our forecasts. So that's how the nation gets to 35 million people by 2046. What share of that do we see getting down to Victoria? So this chart shows the historical growth from a nation of 13 million people in 1971, right up to 35 million people by 2046, and the contribution that each of the different states and territories makes to that total. And you can see there that the 4 largest states, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, and WA, account for 93% of Australia's forecast growth, with 2/3 of that growth in our largest capitals, so Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth. Victoria's grown really steadily over that period, from less than 4 million in the early 70s to 6.6 at the last census. And what you can see there is that its share of national growth, the green line there, which was falling in those couple of decades, that's recovering, and we see that continuing to happen as it adds 2.8 million people to reach a population of 9.4 million by 2046. So what's driving that growth? The state level, there's 3 factors that determine our population changes. So the first is overseas migration. That's the orange line there. We can see Victoria maintaining its share with about 75,000 per year over the forecast period. Natural increase also makes a really steady contribution. That's the blue line of around 40,000 per year. And then at the state level, interstate migration becomes a factor. So that's the green line at the bottom there. In the 80s and 90s, Victoria had net losses of population interstate, but since the early 2000s, it's broken even, and even in recent years had some gains. And our assumption into the forecast period is that it will be net neutral through to 2046. So that's how we get to 2.8 million people in Victoria. Let's have a look at which parts of Victoria get those extra people. So unlike New South Wales, where the growth, as I said, was spread further out of the CBD and into the regional centres, our forecasts show 3/4 of Victoria's growth will be within 80 kilometres of Melbourne CBD. You can sort of see that on the map there, but we'll zoom in and get a bit more detail. So for the purposes of analysing that today, the ABS divide Victoria into 17 regions, or SA4s is a technical term. But for the purposes of today, we've grouped them into 11 regions. So we've got 6 in Greater Melbourne and then 5 regional regions. In Greater Melbourne, we have Inner Melbourne, Melbourne West, Melbourne North, the Outer East, Melbourne Southeast, and then Inner South and down into the Mornington Peninsula. We'll go through them one by one. This chart, though, shows the growth shifts between each of those different regions, both historically and then into the forecast period. And we have removed the COVID period because the data gets a bit crazy through those couple of years. But what you can see is that Inner Melbourne's share was declining even before the pandemic, as lots of apartment projects wrapped up across the CBD, South Bank, Docklands, Carlton and South Yarra. You can also see the growth in the west that really powers ahead as the dominant growth area throughout the forecast period. But you can see that it tapers off there from the mid to 2030s, at which time we see a shift to the North Melbourne region as the dominant source of population growth in Victoria. Similarly, we saw a gradual decline in the share going to the southeast as greenfield opportunities fill up out there, with the CBD compensating with development. So let's go through and have a look at those regions one by one. As I go through these different regions, I've included some icons there that just show what drives growth in each of the regions. And these components of change, they're really important because they determine the extent to which those macro factors that we spoke about before, things like spikes in overseas migration or a declining birth rate, the extent to which those things impact each of these regions differently. And of course, they impact different local areas differently too. So the baby represents natural increase, the net of births and deaths. The plane landing is overseas migration. And the state there with the arrows is internal migration, which is people moving between this particular region and other regions of either Victoria or elsewhere in Australia. If it's green, adding population. If it's red, the opposite. So getting started with Inner Melbourne, forecast to add 418,000 people, or 15% of the state's growth. And in all cases, I'm talking about 2021 to 2046, that 25-year period. So overseas migration is far and away the main driver of growth here, as many people come to Melbourne for work and study. Similarly, it attracts people from other parts of Victoria and Australia, but on balance, the region actually loses population to other regions. And this is because people come to the city in their 20s, but then they migrate out to the suburbs when they have families. So we see Inner Melbourne particularly losing population to the west, the north and the southeast growth areas. Growth in Inner Melbourne is driven by development. There's still a strong pipeline of housing throughout the forecast period, with some notable developments, including the Arden Macaulay precinct up here in North Melbourne, which will get a boost from the dedicated station when the Metro Tunnel opens later this year. There's also still, of course, development around South Bank, Docklands, and of course, Fisherman's Bend. I'll speak more about our development research in these areas shortly too. So in recent years, as I said, Western Melbourne has been and will continue to be the dominant growth area in Victoria, accounting for 20 to 25% of growth over the next few years. Overseas migration is the dominant driver of growth, with natural increase and internal migration, particularly from Inner Melbourne, also driving growth here. The region's forecast to add just over 600,000 people, with steady growth throughout the forecast period. But I'll just bring this chart back up. As we saw before, Western Melbourne, the orange line at the top there, its share does start to decline, and that's really as Wyndham starts to slow down and we see that shift to the growth areas in the north from about the mid 2030s there. So let's look at the north. It combines the northeast and the northwest regions. It's a massive and a significant growth area in our forecasts, and we're seeing things starting to slow down around Mickleham and Craigieburn and start to transfer across to places like Calcallo, Donnybrook, Wallen and Beveridge. Sunbury sort of tends to run its own race a little. We're not expecting it will feel the brunt of population growth with its share of this region's growth declining over time. Instead, the action will be in the Mitchell and the Whittlesea local government areas. Again, overseas migration is the key driver of growth in this region, contributing over 20,000 people in last year, 22-23 alone. And with lots of young families, that means there's a really healthy contribution from natural increase, the baby there, as well as some gains from inner Melbourne. The growth in eastern Melbourne is also predominantly from overseas migration. Natural increase does add a little, but an older population out here means more deaths tend to balance out many of the births that are forecast. The region also loses population to the sort of neighbouring regions. So, southern Melbourne and the Peninsula, the Gippsland and the northeast as well. It's forecast to add 191,000 people, or 7% of forecast growth. And the suburban rail loop is a notable infrastructure project that is due to come online in the mid-2030s, and the impact of that would be mostly felt around activity centres like Box Hill and Burwood. The southeast would also benefit from the completion of the eastern section of the suburban rail loop, impacting the Clayton Activity Centre, where we expect there'll be some turnover of employment land for Resi. But the main story in this region is the Casey Cardinia growth front, with places like Cranbourne, Clyde and Pakenham making this region the second highest contributor to Victoria's growth in recent years, which has been driven mostly by, again, overseas migration. But there are limits to this greenfield growth, so we do expect to see Dandenong start to play a greater role as the region sustains its level of historical growth, albeit a declining share throughout the forecast period. Looking at southern Melbourne and right down into the Mornington Peninsula. So this region gets a lot of population from overseas migration, but that's a really good example of why it's important to have a localised view of things, because that's mostly going to be up here around Melbourne's inner south. And again, with an older population, the peninsula loses people to retirement areas in southeast Queensland and has a higher number of deaths than other areas, meaning there's very little growth contribution from the yellow baby there. We're expecting some new housing around the suburban rail loop terminus at Cheltenham, but as an established area, the peninsula has very little opportunity for significant development. The state government have released some modelling around flood propensities from sea level rises, which could affect places like Frankston, but that hasn't yet impacted our land use assessments in the way that we saw in Marsden Park when we were looking at New South Wales. Speak a bit more about that later. So that's a summary for Greater Melbourne. Let's have a look at the rest of Victoria as well, which we've broken into Geelong and out into the west coast, Ballarat and up into the northwest, Bendigo as its own region, the northeast and the Goulburn Valley, including the SA4s of Hume and Shepparton, and then Gippsland, which of course includes the Latrobe Valley. As I mentioned earlier, regional growth is steady, but at less than a quarter of the state's overall growth. And as you can see here, the regional areas with the highest shares of forecast growth are those that are sort of connected to the peri-urban fringes of Greater Melbourne. So Geelong and those parts of the Gippsland region that connect onto the Casey Cardinia growth front. So starting with Geelong on the west coast, as you can see, perhaps unsurprisingly, it's all concentrated in and around the growth areas of Geelong, where there's been consistent demand, and the work from home phenomenon comes into play a bit here as well, with a V-Line service into Melbourne. Overseas migration is once again the dominant driver of growth, but there is strong internal migration gains to the region from across Greater Melbourne. Geelong has a massive amount of land identified through its north and western growth corridors, so there's no issue at all with capacity but in recent times it has lost some of its price advantage. So it's now cheaper to buy land in parts of Western Melbourne than it is to get a block of land, say, in somewhere like Armstrong Creek. Looking further out west in Warrnambool in the southwest, once you get beyond that 2-hour drive to Melbourne, there are different forces at play, so we don't see the same level of growth forecast in those regions. As you might expect, again, most of the growth in the Ballarat Northwest region is around Ballarat, where the council have been very proactive in accommodating population growth, resulting in very steady growth over recent years. We've got some forecast growth in regional centres like Horsham and Mildura, which means necessarily, given that our forecast for a given region all add up to the regional total, other places in rural parts of the Northwest region will be going backwards. Overall, the region gains mostly from overseas migration with an ageing population, and there's negligible growth from natural increase. Gains a little from Western Melbourne, but that's balanced out by losses to Geelong and young people moving to other cities, other capital cities, interstate for work and study. Go forward, not backwards. In Bendigo, similar story to Ballarat in the northwest, though it has much stronger internal migration gains from across Greater Melbourne and parts of the northeast. So we're often asked about the significance of the tree change phenomenon to places like Kyneton, Castlemaine, northern reaches of the Macedon Ranges. This does have a localised impact in some areas, but these aren't significant migration flows when we're looking at this regional story. It's something that we'll look at a lot more when we publish our local area analysis for each of these regions, and I'll talk more about how you can get those updates shortly. In the northeast, Wodonga is a notable growth area. As a cross-border town, it has a critical mass of population and employment that it shares with Albury. Shepparton's seen consistent rates of growth, which we expect to continue. Overseas migration, once again, the primary growth driver, but it would appear that things are otherwise fairly stable here. But as I mentioned at the start, there's an old adage that says just because an area isn't growing doesn't mean that it isn't changing. So that yellow icon there for internal migration, that hides a lot of movement. Just looking at the data that we got a couple of weeks ago for 22-23, over 16,000 people moved in that 1 year. 16,000 people came to the region and a bit over 16,000 people left. So at this regional level, that story is really averaged out. We're just looking at the total population. But in reality, those migration flows, they're often age specific. So people moving for work are often younger, retirees obviously older. So if you're planning for age specific services like retirement villages or schools, care facilities, certain types of housing, our local area forecasts do provide age specific reports that show up those age specific migration assumptions that are in our forecasts. Finally, to round out the regions, just coming to Gippsland, there's obviously some uncertainty down here about how transitions to renewables will affect energy towns like Traralgon and Morwell in the Latrobe Valley, and similarly, we're monitoring the impact of changes to native logging laws on timber towns like Orbost in East Gippsland. But from a regional perspective, the really significant growth here is around, as I said before, the peri-urban areas extending out from the southeastern growth fronts. So internal migration, actually a bit unique in this area in that internal migration is the dominant driver of growth. We're forecasting growth in the Bass Coast and the Baw Baw Shires, so places like Druin and Warragul, places that are within a commutable distance of southeast Melbourne, and obviously places like Phillip Island, where holiday homes have the potential for permanent occupation. So after that review of the regions, you might be sitting there going, hang on a minute, I'm really interested in Box Hill or Tarneit or the Southern Grampians, and you've just whipped right over that. As I mentioned before, this is really where we're up to in our process. So our team are currently working on new detailed forecasts for the local areas within each of these regions. And we'll be releasing those over the coming weeks and months, including detailed write-ups that the forecasters publish for each of these areas. So if you've got your phone handy, this QR code will take you to a page on our website where you can register to be notified of new forecasts as they come out. And that will include links to those write-ups and the detailed analysis for those regions. On that page, you'll see a menu like this where you can select any of the regions that are of particular interest to you, or just hit all if you want to get a notification for every time we publish a forecast. Don't worry if you don't have your mobile handy. We'll include a link to this form in the pack that we send around this afternoon. And the other way that you can get this information about local areas is via one of our forecast products, which is how we fund, as I said before, our ongoing research. So these products, they range from data downloads to the detailed reports and tailored subscription services that are designed for different industries and different types of decisions that you might need to make. So just to look at a couple of those, Forecast ID Hotspots, for example, is a tailored consulting report that helps you choose the next location for your business, whether it's an investment or a new service location. And it does that by comparing forecast information from across the country, or across a city or across a region, wherever you're looking to make a location decision. And it identifies up to 10 locations with the highest forecast growth in a demographic, so age group or sex group that your organisation serves. If you're a consultant, you regularly need forecast information, you might like to consider our Partners Program. We have many of the largest consultancies in Australia now leveraging our specialisation in this area. They assess forecast data for custom areas via a self-serve tool. They instantly get the data, and it just leaves them more time to do less of the grunt work behind the forecasting process and just doing more of what they do best for their clients. And of course, Forecast ID is our forecasting service for local government, and there are many people from local government on the call today. Thing to say is that Forecast ID is now powered by the National Forecasting Program. And Forecast ID Catchments you might not have heard of before. It's a new extension for that product that gives your council access to the really detailed map-based reporting, custom and cross-border catchments, and detailed development data, and a lot more. You can learn more about that if you'd like to get in touch with us after the presentation today. The other one to mention is Forecast ID Premium. That's a subscription service. So in this program, we work really closely with our clients to understand what they need, what forecast information at what geography, how you'd like those forecasts delivered to best integrate with your organisation. Then we tailor a program around that. So there'll be links to learn about all of these different options in the pack that we send around this afternoon. If you're not sure, please just reply to that email and one of our team will be really happy to come back to you and discuss the different options. But to share the research that underpins these local area forecasts, until now we've been really focused on the demographics. It's all about births, deaths and migration and how that's shaping different regions. But down at this local level, it's all about understanding housing. We have a team of researchers whose job it is to build a comprehensive picture of current and future housing supply in every area where we publish forecasts. That might sound easy, but that's very detailed and labour-intensive work, which is important for a couple of reasons. In a place like Melbourne, demand does outweigh supply. So there's a lot more people who'd like to live there than there are dwellings for them to live in. So if you're simply looking at the demographics, you really risk overpopulating an area in your forecasts. So by assessing the capacity for housing, we make sure we only put as much population into a place as it has the housing capacity to accommodate. The second thing is that this research gives us a really detailed picture of forecast growth. So by matching population to housing, we get a much more granular view of where forecast growth is expected to occur within a given region. For those familiar with ABS geography, where many government forecasts are published at SA2s, our forecasts go right down to SA1 level and even smaller in growth areas. So looking at this time series example from Hobart, it really illustrates the difference. Up here, there's a big amount of growth, but you'd have to make an assumption about where it's happening. With our forecast, you can see that they're right here in and around Sorell. The third thing is that these parcels can then be combined to generate forecast reports for custom areas. So whether that's a school catchment, retail, trade area, or a 5, 10 or 20 kilometre radius around a particular location, that very granular forecast information lets you build that custom catchment. And in registering for the webinar, a lot of people actually asked us what's the research process behind that housing information? Where do we get it from? It doesn't come from a single source, which is partly why our housing research is so labour intensive. So we combine data from a range of sources, including housing data and address files. We look at aerial imagery. to keep track of projects that have broken ground. We look at cadastre layers, we digitise structure plans, and we extensively research advertised developments. We also assess longer term capacities based on longer term local planning controls. And because we work with over 300 councils across Australia, we can consult with the planning team to get their advice on particular sites, also making provisions for infill and densification. And here's an example of that from our really recent work. This is what it looks like when it's done. It's a map of our residential development forecasts for the greenfield growth areas around Melbourne's west. And you can see there that the different sites are categorised based on their different stages of development. So light green are areas that are currently under construction, orange areas have commenced site work. The light blue is capacity based on our assessment of structure plans for the precinct. They'll be used more likely further into the forecast period. So that amounts to the most comprehensive view that we have in Australia of future housing stock. And because it's not just about housing supply, it's matched with population demand. It's not just a map of total capacity, but it gives the location and the forecast timing of development on each one of those development sites. So as we update our development research for Victoria, there's a couple of themes and factors that have emerged that shape our view of our forecast for these areas. The first is climate risk. So it's a really common question we're asked is how climate change is factored into our forecasts. When we recently presented our forecast for Tasmania, we saw a strong retirement migration down south, and many people on the call commented that they thought that was at least in part due to climate change. On the demographic side of things, we look for evidence of changing migration patterns. But at the housing level, we're really looking at what's currently built and what can be built given planning controls. So there's plenty of examples of places that are zoned for flood risk that have got occupied dwellings. And in terms of future development, while places like Frankston and Elwood are identified as flood exposed, many areas are of course exposed to the risks of bushfires. We haven't yet seen significant restrictions on land use due to climate risk in the same way that we saw up in New South Wales. The second is infrastructure projects. So we've already mentioned the suburban rail loop and the metro tunnel as projects that are part of Victoria's big build. Rail infrastructure impacts our thinking because we anticipate development around stations and activity centres along that rail network. The Melbourne Airport rail project's currently on hold. We'll monitor those negotiations, but there's not a lot of dwelling or development connected with that project. And other things like the Westgate Tunnel project, level crossing removals, they're more about decongesting existing infrastructure and making a better experience for commuters. Housing supply chain constraints are factored into our forecast as well. We have to acknowledge that there's a constraint on development in the ability to actually build more housing. So in 2022, the federal government announced the National Housing Accord with the goal to build 1 million new homes in the 5 years from 2024. The construction industry has been really clear that they need to advocate for the need for more skilled labour, challenges with material supply, as well as financing that future development. And the fourth and final factor is housing affordability. So we factor in the relative affordability of housing when we're determining the share of total growth for Victoria that will go to each region. And we mentioned the example of Melbourne's West versus Geelong earlier. If you're interested in housing data, we have a separate team at ID who are dedicated to understanding all aspects of affordability, but we'll include links to that in this afternoon's pack. I won't linger here because I know we're at time and I really want to get to the Q&A. So just a quick recap before we do that. Make sure you sign up to our local area analysis to get a detailed look at these local areas as they are released over the coming weeks. But recapping our main points there, the fact that we've seen a return to normal demographic programming gives us confidence in the migration assumptions that are in our forecasts. As we showed, most of Victoria's growth is within a commutable distance of Melbourne. We looked at the unique role of students and how they're affecting the post-pandemic rebound of our capital cities and sort of the unique housing implications of that cohort driving the overseas migration rebound. We discussed why we're forecasting a shift from western and southeastern growth fronts and that have driven Melbourne's growth in recent years toward more growth in the north and the CBD from the mid-2030s. And just finally, that reminder that just because places aren't growing, that doesn't mean they're not changing. And the age structure of the population is really important to understand if your organisation serves a particular age group. Coming in your inbox this afternoon, there'll be a link to the resources page for this webinar, which includes a copy of the recording, a short video recap that we'll record, the presentation slides if you'd like to share those with any of your colleagues, and also links to the page to get notified of new forecasts as they're released, and to all the other resources and tools from ID that we've covered in the presentation today. So let's hop across to the Q&A and hear from Johnny and Katie. You can come back on screen here. Let me just give them a quick introduction. So Johnny is our lead forecaster. He's led our recent work on these regional forecasts for Victoria. One of the founding members of ID, over 30 years of experience in demographics planning and forecasting. So Johnny brings an enormous knowledge of places across Australia to our forecasting work. And Katie might also be a familiar face in that she works with a lot of our industry clients in particular. So Katie comes from a background in spatial analysis and GIS and has had a long involvement with the National Forecasting Program, helping our clients to apply the forecasts in their work. And just to briefly introduce a couple of other members who aren't on screen today, but if you're in touch with this, you're likely to be speaking with them. So Hamish, Jake, Sally and Dita work with our partners in local government, and Sally, Katie and Brian all work closely with our industry clients. So you'll be likely speaking with them if you get back in touch with us. Let me stop sharing the presentation and bring up the others on screen here. And I'll just grab, we've been curating a Q&A list as we've been going, both from the questions that were submitted from our from the registration form when you signed up for the webinar, but also throughout the Q&A today. Thanks to everyone who submitted your questions. We're going to start with one from Shane Cowie and also from Cameron Wilson, who come from Greater Western Water and Yarra Valley Water, respectively. And having spoken with Shane not long ago, it's the work that these guys do to understand population movements and cater for utilities in some of the fastest growing parts of Melbourne is quite phenomenal in its own right. But the question that they've had coming through here is Greater Western Water and Yarra Valley Water have both asked questions in relation to the impact of the pandemic on the forecasts and population growth in Victoria, particularly the changes to the forecasts as we've come out of that COVID sort of redistribution and adjusting to work from home. Johnny, is that one that I can ask you to speak to, please?
Sure, yeah. I think, Andrew, you touched on a lot of these sorts of issues. So I guess the main thrust of it would be a return to sort of more standard pre-COVID trends in terms of migration. So certainly migration from Metro Melbourne to regional Victoria has slowed down, whether that's a direct impact of people going back to the office to some extent or not, who knows. So we anticipate in our forecast that there's just sort of a more standard level of growth in the regions compared to Melbourne over time.
Hedge, you're on mute.
Thank you. That was courteous of me. Any additional comment on the work from home factor?
Sorry, what's that?
Just if you want to expand a little more on that work from home and whether that's been a significant factor that we've.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking work from home in terms of its impact on out-migration to regional areas. It's not just a Victorian thing. This would be in New South Wales as well. Look, it's certainly an impact. We're probably just not seeing. I guess the issue is we're certainly seeing some return to the office, and we're seeing people needing to be within some commuting distance of sort of major employment areas in Melbourne. So, and you talked about that overwhelming majority of population growth in Victoria being within 80 kilometres of Melbourne. So, whilst we still have growth in Geelong and particularly in Gippsland, you talked about areas just outside the southeast of Melbourne in sort of Balboa and Bass Coast and these sorts of places. those are the sorts of areas we're still expecting to see growth, because there are places that if you have to come into the office 2 days a week in Melbourne, you can do so. But sort of beyond that sort of 100, 2 hour sort of range of Melbourne, not huge amounts of growth.
Thank you. Staying with utilities for a moment, Cameron had another question, which was around information on the historic and projected numbers of people per household, so average household sizes, given the high migration and recent low building approvals. Johnny, do you want to talk to that?
Yes, as I've said many times, it's a pretty challenging time to be a forecaster at the moment. So a lot of the traditional trends around sort of decreases in average household size and dwelling construction have sort of been thrown out the door. So our census in Melbourne took place during lockdown. So, and you spoke before, Andrew, about the numbers of vacant dwellings in inner Melbourne. We also had a lot of growth just sort of straight after the COVID period in terms of housing construction, particularly in the fringes of Melbourne, as people took advantage of the home builders grant as well. So we had sort of conflicting trends in that sort of period where average household sizes were sort of dropping to reflect a lot of that demand that had been brought forward by the sort of spurt in activity. Obviously, things have gone into reverse now. So we have relatively few dwellings being built, given the population growth we're experiencing and the number we're experiencing. From a forecasting perspective, the way we do our modelling is we start with people. We put people, then we have to figure out how to house them. So in terms of housing people in a lot of these places, it's essentially about making assumptions of increasing average household size and decreasing vacancy. Basically, everyone's having to squish up so we can all fit in. But as you pointed out before, Andrew, there's obviously some degree of that NOM was taking up dwellings that were vacant in 2021, so absorbing existing dwellings.
Thanks for that. And Cameron, if we can elaborate on that further after the call today, we're certainly happy to get in touch and go through some of our modelling in a bit more detail with you. Just going to mention, I know we're close to time, but we're just going to continue with the Q&A after 1:30. So if you're able to stick around, please do so. And we'll get through a few of these questions here. Caroline Gillies is with the City of Yarra, our home LGA, with our office there in Collingwood. Caroline just asked, well, really interesting question here. So what do we do when the results of ID's forecasts and the VIF, which is Victoria and Future, the official state government forecasts, what do we do when they're significantly different? And how can we build confidence in the forecasts and sell the story in our advocacy work? Katie, I'm going to hand that to you, but just before I do, perhaps the first thing to say is that's part of the reason why we run these webinars, is that we want to invite people to come and understand our thinking behind the forecast, understand the assumptions that we make at different levels. But yeah, perhaps so. The recording of this presentation is of course available afterwards to share with people that you're speaking with. But Katie, would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you. So firstly, I guess ID's forecast, we are independent, so we don't have to take in big state policy sort of positions, but we're independent and we have this robust methodology where we match our macro drivers of demographic change and growth, and we match that with our site-based housing research. So forecasting at this small level builds a greater level of confidence in the forecast because we're ground truthing that housing development pipeline, and we share that layer with you, and so you can understand all the developments that have gone into our forecast to basically justify where we see that population coming from. And especially when compared to VIF, we develop our forecast at a micro geography, SA1 or smaller in some areas, and doing this allows you to stitch up areas, and I believe VIF is released at SA2, that's the lowest area. So just to forecast at that micro level, we need to go into quite a bit of detail into what is underpinning our forecasts. But again, it's good to check the base data that was used when the forecasts were produced and that level of detail and research that has gone into forming those forecasts.
Yeah, that was the example that we saw down in down in Tassie in Hobart that we showed during the presentation, that SA2 versus an SA1 and smaller version of where growth is happening and how that creates those custom catchment areas. The other thing to mention there is that we regularly have people from state government departments coming along to these webinars and yeah, keeping tabs on the way that we look at these places. Next question was from Development Victoria, Diana Nelson. Welcome and thanks a lot for joining us, Diana. What underlying assumptions go into the forecast, and what are the key ones that have changed the population forecast trajectories? Obviously gave a bit of a presentation of that today, but Johnny, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, I think it was mostly covered in the presentation, as you're suggesting. The big picture assumptions, of course, in any forecast from a top-down perspective are those net overseas migration assumptions, the state shares of assumptions, interstate migration forecast or assumptions are also quite important as well. And then it gets down to a sort of sub-state level, effectively how we match up supply and demand. So you can certainly have situations where there's too much demand and not enough housing. A lot of areas of Melbourne in that situation. And you'll have areas that are the reverse as well. So we're effectively at a regional level and then down to a suburb level, making calls around that balance between supply and demand. And I think we had a question on the chat about the West slowing down, and a lot of that is about growth that has been, or potential growth areas that have been identified as we know them right now. And of course, the case of the city of Wyndham, sort of effectively the area out to the Outer Metropolitan Ring Road reservation is identified for housing. But if all of a sudden they found another 20,000 potential dwellings worth of supply in the city of Wyndham, that sort of stuff would affect our forecast, because we know there is actually demand in a place like that, and we would look to reflect that in the forecast. So it's a combination of those where land has been identified and where we see demand.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. There's also a video that we'll include a link to in our notes that go around this afternoon that just runs through kind of our process start to finish in a bit more detail, that might help you understand exactly what assumptions we make at each point in the process. Just a quick cheerio to everybody that has to hop off at past. Thank you very much for joining us. But as I said, we'll just carry on with the couple more questions here. Next one was from Jacqueline at Kumon. So we know Kumon tutoring company, and they're particularly interested in forecasted population growth for children aged 0 to 14 across Victoria and South Australia. So Katie, do you want to speak to that maybe from the perspective of how we would work with a problem like that?
Yeah. So the forecasts we produce are by single year of age, and the beauty of that means that when you subscribe, you can dissect the data into any age range that makes sense for you. So Kumon requiring 0 to 14-year-olds, we can extract that data quite quickly. But it also is relevant to any organisation with age-based sort of services. So primary schools is from 5 to 11-year-olds. Aged care, you're looking at, they're 75 plus. We can very easily extract those exact age cohorts for your business need.
Thanks, Katie. And yeah, we'll include links to all those different options in the pack this afternoon. Keeping going, Keith Alfonso from Domain Media, interested in the demographic impact on housing development. We don't have enough homes being built, increase of average household size, decrease in vacancy rates. You broadly spoke to that before, Johnny. Was there anything that you'd add to that?
No, that sort of has generally been covered. I guess the other issue is that, that our current forecasts are assuming that things pick up over the next 5 or 6 years, and we start being able to construct a lot more dwellings, and we start to recover that balance a little bit. But given what's going on with, as you pointed out before, with materials and labour and just impediments to investment in housing, obviously we'll keep a close eye on how we're going and returning to some sort of equilibrium over the next 5 or 6 years.
Yeah. Change tack slightly. There was a question from Rose up in Shepparton, who was saying that there's been a change in the definitions of their new ward structures and their geographic boundaries at their council. And how can we capture the population data under the new ward structure? Katie, Johnny, who'd like to take that one?
Yeah, sure, I'll talk to that one. So one of the reasons why we do forecast at our microgeography is to enable that flexibility to build up catchments that makes sense to how you use information. So by forecasting at SA1, we should be able to create the new ward structures and get accurate population forecasts for those areas. And so that flexibility, again, is a key point of differentiation from state government forecasts.
Yeah, and we did mention the Forecast ID Catchments product, which is new for local government, and that's basically a map-based interface that lets your council go in and create those custom reports on demand. So that's not a case of writing away to us and asking for a new forecast for a ward. That information's there at your fingertips. It's designed for exactly that purpose. So Dita is a great person to speak to if you wanted more information about that, Rose. Going to pop down to Jane's question from the Department of Transport. Jane's asking particularly about Gippsland LGAs, comparison of peri-urban growth areas in Victoria, ageing population areas in different parts of Victoria. Curious to understand where that question's coming from, Jane, but Johnny, is that something that you're able to perhaps provide some commentary on, maybe more around what's happening down around Gippsland, as you said, comparing the different drivers of growth from people coming out from the southeast versus people who are more the work from home cohort around Phillip Island and other parts out in the eastern part of the region?
Yeah, as I was saying, we've obviously got a reasonable amount of growth forecast in Gippsland, and a lot of that is to do with the southeast of Melbourne starting to slowly run out of land during the forecast period. I know we've got more land identified around Pakenham East and so on, but there will be pressures probably in both directions, probably from a Greenville perspective out to Druin and Warragul and Bass Coast and so on, but also pressures back up towards more established areas like Dandenong and so on to accommodate future growth. In terms of the ageing, I haven't looked specifically at how that sort of works in regional areas, Victoria and Gippsland versus other areas. So it's probably something we could look at presenting in future presentations of this work. We sort of look at location of growth probably more than the ageing over time.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. We might bring in a bit more about age structures. Yep. Some examples up around Shepparton and the northeast as well. Conscious with it, we're over time here, but might just try and sneak in a couple more quick questions. Travis said Victoria's just legalised granny flats. Are you taking that into account? John, are you able to speak to how that's factored into our modelling?
Not specifically. We certainly make assumptions about rates of infill in our forecasts. So we factor in sites, greenfield, apartment buildings and so on, but also make an assumption about how many houses in local streets are going to turn into dual locks and units and all of that sort of thing. So there are assumptions there. It'd be interesting to know, it's always a definitional thing with us because is granny flat a separate dwelling or is it just counted as part of the main dwelling? If it's counted as part of the main dwelling, then it has more people living there. Then that impacts more our average household size assumptions for areas rather than dwelling totals necessarily. So definitely keen to look into that further and the wait and see approach as to how they're classified, and often it's up to the ABS as to what specifically they do with these sorts of dwellings.
Yeah. There's a number of other questions which we'll have to follow up after the presentation. I think we'll have to wrap it there. Do want to thank everybody for taking the time to spend your lunch with us today, and Johnny and Katie and others online for joining us as well. As I said, email will be coming around this afternoon with a link to all the recordings, all the resources we've spoken through today. And please stay tuned because we have more of these coming up in the future. We'll be updating our national to state figures, which will be the next opportunity to run a webinar and talk about our latest view of how those top-down drivers, particularly overseas migration, the latest information we have about that, are shaping that total growth number. So please stay tuned to updates for those, and hope you can join us at those presentations. But thanks very much, and hope we see you next time. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.